Maria Santos had always been known as the unbreakable woman of San Miguel. At 53, she ran the largest emergency shelter in the Philippines, a place where hundreds of families found refuge during the worst storms. Her weathered hands had pulled countless people from floodwaters, and her fierce determination had saved more lives than anyone could count. The locals whispered that she was blessed, protected by some divine force that kept her safe while she rescued others. The morning of September 15th started like any other typhoon day. The radio crackled with warnings about Typhoon Helena, a Category 4 storm barreling toward their coastal town. Maria moved through her shelter with practiced efficiency, checking supplies and comforting the families who had already arrived. Children clung to their mothers while elderly couples sat quietly, their eyes reflecting decades of surviving nature's fury. But Helena was different. The meteorologists had underestimated her power, and by noon the winds were already stronger than anything Maria had experienced. The old concrete building that housed her shelter began to groan under the pressure. Windows shattered one by one, sending glass cascading across the floor where families huddled together. Maria grabbed her emergency radio and started coordinating with rescue teams, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. As the afternoon wore on, the situation became desperate. The storm surge was higher than predicted, and water began seeping through the foundation. Maria made the difficult decision to move everyone to the upper floors. Even though the building was shaking violently with each gust of wind, she helped carry an elderly man up the stairs while shouting instructions to her volunteers. Her mind raced through contingency plans, but deep down, she knew they were running out of options. The last thing Maria remembered clearly was the sound of concrete cracking above her head. She had just finished moving a family of 6 to what she thought was safety, when she heard the terrible groaning of metal and stone. She looked up to see a massive section of the ceiling beginning to give way. Without hesitation, she threw herself over 3 small children who were too frightened to move, shielding them with her body as the world came crashing down around them. The collapse happened in seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Chunks of concrete and twisted metal rained down as the upper floor pancaked into the space where they had been standing. The building that had sheltered thousands over the years had finally met its match. In the darkness that followed, the only sounds were the howling wind and the distant cries of survivors trapped in the rubble. Maria's legend was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. The first sensation Maria became aware of was the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. Everything was pitch black, and the weight pressing down on her back felt like the entire world had collapsed on top of her. She tried to move but realized she was pinned beneath a massive concrete beam. Her left arm was trapped at an awkward angle, and sharp pain shot through her ribs with every shallow breath she managed to take. Slowly, her mind began to clear, and she remembered the children. She had thrown herself over them just before the collapse, but now she couldn't hear their voices. Panic gave her strength she didn't know she still had. Using her free right hand, she felt around in the darkness until her fingers touched something soft and warm. A small hand gripped hers weakly, and she heard the faintest whisper of her name. "I'm here," she managed to croak, her throat dry and filled with dust. "All of you, stay close to me." She could feel 3 small bodies pressed against her, still alive but terribly frightened. The concrete beam that had crushed her spine was actually creating a small pocket of space that was keeping the children from being completely buried. In her agony, Maria realized that her body was the only thing standing between these children and certain death. Hours passed in the suffocating darkness. Maria drifted in and out of consciousness, but each time she woke, she forced herself to whisper reassurances to the children. She told them stories about her own childhood, about the time she had rescued a stray dog during a flood, about anything that might keep their minds off their terrifying situation. Her voice grew weaker with each story, but she refused to let silence take over. The pain in her back was becoming unbearable. She could feel warm blood pooling beneath her, and her legs had gone completely numb. She knew her injuries were severe, possibly fatal, but she pushed those thoughts away. Above the constant ringing in her ears, she could hear the storm still raging outside. Rescue wouldn't come until Helena passed, and that could be many more hours. One of the children, a little girl named Anna, was crying softly. Maria managed to reach her face and wipe away her tears with trembling fingers. "Listen to me, little one," she whispered. "Do you remember the story I told you about the lighthouse keeper? He never gave up his light no matter how strong the storm. That's what we're going to do. We're going to keep our light burning until help comes." Even as she spoke these brave words, Maria felt her own light beginning to flicker in the crushing darkness beneath the rubble. Dawn brought no relief from their underground prison. The storm had finally passed, but Maria and the 3 children remained trapped in their tiny pocket of space beneath tons of debris. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly. The bleeding had slowed, but her breathing was becoming more labored and waves of dizziness washed over her every few minutes. She knew she was going into shock, but she fought to stay conscious for the sake of the children who depended on her. Above them, the rescue operation had begun at first light. Captain Rodriguez of the local fire department stood surveying the complete destruction of the shelter that had once been Maria's pride and joy. The building was reduced to a mountain of broken concrete, twisted metal, and shattered dreams. His rescue dogs were working their way through the debris, but the damage was so extensive that he privately doubted they would find any survivors. Maria Santos was in there, one of the volunteers told him, tears streaming down her face. She never left during a storm. If anyone could have survived this, it would be her. Rodriguez nodded grimly. He had known Maria for 15 years, had watched her pull off miracle rescues that defied logic. But looking at the devastation before him, even he struggled to maintain hope. Deep beneath the rubble, Maria heard the first faint sounds of rescue efforts. The scraping of metal on concrete, the distant barking of search dogs, and most importantly, human voices calling out. She tried to shout back, but her voice was barely a whisper now. The children were getting weaker too. Hannah had stopped responding to her questions, though Maria could still feel her shallow breathing. "Help is coming," she told them, putting every ounce of conviction she could muster into her words. "I can hear them up there. They're looking for us and they won't stop until they find us." She began tapping on a piece of metal pipe with a small stone she had found, creating a rhythmic pattern that she hoped would carry to the surface. Tap, tap, tap. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The international distress signal she had taught to countless volunteers over the years. Hours crawled by as the rescue teams worked methodically through the debris. Maria's tapping grew weaker, but she never stopped completely. Even when consciousness threatened to slip away entirely, she forced herself to keep the signal going. Above them, one of the rescue dogs suddenly became excited, pawing frantically at a particular section of rubble. Rodriguez rushed over and pressed his ear to the concrete. In the distance, barely audible, he could hear the faint sound of metal tapping against stone. Someone was alive down there and they were trying to communicate. The rescue operation kicked into high gear once they confirmed there were survivors beneath the debris. Heavy machinery was brought in to carefully remove the larger pieces of concrete, while specialized teams with sensitive listening equipment worked to pinpoint the exact location of the trapped victims. Rodriguez coordinated the effort with military precision, knowing that every minute counted. The tapping had stopped an hour ago, and that silence filled him with dread. Maria was barely conscious now, floating in and out of awareness like a person drowning in slow motion. Her body had shut down all non-essential functions to preserve what little life remained in her. The children pressed against her had grown terrifyingly still, and she could no longer tell if they were breathing. With tremendous effort, she managed to place her hand on Anna's chest and felt the flutter of a heartbeat. Weak but persistent. "Stay with me, babies," she whispered into the darkness, though she wasn't sure if any sound actually came out. "I promised your mothers I would keep you safe, and Maria Santos never breaks her promises." Even in her delirium, she clung to that identity, to the reputation that had sustained her through decades of impossible rescues. She was the unbreakable woman, and she would not break now. 20 feet above them, the rescue team had finally cleared enough debris to create a narrow shaft down to where the signals had originated. A paramedic named Elena volunteered to be lowered down on ropes despite the dangerous instability of the surrounding wreckage. She was small enough to fit through the opening and experienced enough to assess the medical situation quickly. As she descended into the darkness, her headlamp cutting through the dust-filled air, she called out repeatedly, "Hello, can anyone hear me? This is the rescue team." Her voice echoed in the confined space, but there was no response. Elena's heart sank as she reached the bottom of the shaft and began searching through the smaller debris with her hands. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creaking of unstable concrete above her head. She was about to radio up that the space appeared empty when her glove touched something warm and soft. It was a human hand, pale and covered in dust but unmistakably alive. Elena's pulse quickened as she cleared away chunks of concrete and debris, revealing an older woman who appeared to be shielding 3 small children with her body. The woman's eyes fluttered open at Elena's touch, and she managed to focus on the paramedic's face with tremendous effort. "The children," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Save the children first." Even on the brink of death after 18 hours trapped in a concrete tomb, Maria Santos was still thinking about others before herself. The extraction was the most delicate operation Rodriguez had ever supervised. The concrete beam pinning Maria down weighed several tons, and any wrong move could cause the remaining structure to collapse completely. Engineers calculated angles and stress points while medical teams prepared for the worst. Maria had been unconscious for the past 2 hours, but her vital signs, though weak, remained steady. The children were in critical condition but alive, their small bodies having been protected by Maria's sacrifice. Elena had managed to establish an IV line and was administering fluids and pain medication through the narrow shaft. She talked constantly to Maria, even though the woman couldn't respond, telling her about the rescue efforts and reassuring her that the children were going to be okay. "You did it, Maria," she whispered. "You saved them. You kept your promise." The paramedic had worked hundreds of emergency calls, but she had never seen anything like this level of selfless protection. After 6 grueling hours of careful excavation, the engineering team finally had the beam stabilized enough to lift it with hydraulic jacks. The process had to be done millimeter by millimeter to avoid shifting weight onto other unstable sections. Maria's nephew Diego had arrived and was watching from the safety perimeter, tears streaming down his face as he saw his aunt's broken body finally being revealed. She looked impossibly small and fragile, nothing like the tower of strength he had known all his life. The moment the beam was lifted, a full medical team swarmed into the space. Maria's injuries were severe: a fractured spine, internal bleeding, multiple broken ribs, and severe dehydration. But somehow, impossibly, she was still breathing on her own. As they carefully moved her onto a backboard, her eyes opened one more time. She looked around frantically until she saw the 3 children being attended to by other medics. Only then did she allow herself to relax. "The children," she managed to whisper to the doctor working on her. "Are they going to be okay?" Dr. Reyes, a veteran emergency physician, was amazed that this was her first concern after being crushed under debris for nearly 20 hours. "They're going to be fine," he assured her. "They're alive because of you. All 3 of them are going to go home to their families, because you protected them." A smile flickered across Maria's dust-covered face before she slipped back into unconsciousness as the ambulances raced toward the hospital with sirens wailing. Word of the miraculous rescue spread throughout the community. The unbreakable woman had done the impossible once again, but this time the cost had been almost everything she had. The doctors at Regional Medical Center prepared for the fight of their lives, knowing they were treating not just a patient, but a local legend who had defied death itself to save 3 innocent children. The surgery lasted 14 hours. Dr. Reyes and his team worked through the night to repair Maria's shattered spine and stop the internal bleeding that threatened to claim her life. Twice her heart stopped on the operating table, and twice they managed to bring her back. Outside in the waiting room, hundreds of people had gathered, families she had rescued over the years, volunteers from the shelter, government officials, and complete strangers who had heard her story on the news. The 3 children she had saved were recovering in the pediatric wing. Anna, the little girl who had cried in the darkness, was asking every nurse when she could see Tita Maria again. Her parents had tried to explain how seriously injured their hero was, but the 6-year-old simply couldn't understand why the strongest person she knew might not get better. The other 2 children, brothers aged 4 and 7, had been reunited with their parents but kept drawing pictures of the lady, who had kept them safe in the dark. When Maria finally woke up 3 days later, the first thing she saw was a wall covered in cards, flowers, and drawings from children all over the Philippines. Her room looked like a garden, filled with tokens of gratitude from the countless lives she had touched. Her nephew Diego was sleeping in a chair beside her bed, and she could see news crews setting up in the hallway outside. She tried to speak but found her throat too dry to make any sound. Dr. Reyes entered the room just as she was attempting to sit up. "Easy there," he said gently, checking her monitors. "You've been through quite an ordeal. The good news is that the surgery was successful. You're going to live, Maria. And even better news, all 3 children are completely healthy. They're calling you a hero on every news channel in the country. Maria shook her head weakly, dismissing the praise as she always did. The road to recovery was long and difficult. The damage to Maria's spine meant she would never walk again, a reality that devastated someone who had spent her life in constant motion, always running toward the next person who needed help. But as she slowly regained her strength, she began to understand that her legend had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. Donations poured in from around the world to rebuild the shelter, bigger and stronger than before. 6 months later, Maria sat in her wheelchair at the dedication ceremony for the new shelter, which had been renamed the Santos Emergency Center in her honor. Anna and the 2 brothers she had saved were there with their families, healthy and laughing as they played in the sunshine. As the ribbon was cut and the crowd cheered, Maria realized that being broken didn't mean being defeated. She was still breathing, still fighting, still saving lives in her own way. The legend of the unbreakable woman had evolved, but it lived on stronger than ever, inspiring a new generation of heroes who understood that sometimes the greatest strength comes from being willing to break yourself to protect others.